Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 272 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technological firm that helps companies manage risk across 4 key risk areas. These risk areas include sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, and partners, suppliers, customers, and human capital, which of course includes employees and contractors. You can check out more information on the Red Flag Group at their website, which is www.redflaggroup.com. While you're on that site, I hope you will check out the upcoming webinar that Chris Sidnick, Jared Connors, and I are going to be doing, where we take a deep dive into supply chain risk management. In July, we had a webinar where we talked about the general concepts around supply chain risk management. We're going to take the next 3 months to really break it down and unpack it. And this first really unpacked episode is breaking your supply chain down into manageable pieces for a risk-based approach. The webinar will be held on Thursday, August 16th, 2016, 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central, 9 a.m. Mountain, 8 a.m. Pacific. And if you're in London or on GMT, it'll be 4 p.m. So registration is free. I hope you'll go to the Red Flag Group website, click the tab Webinars, and that will give you the information. Today I have with me Matt Ellis. Matt is a partner at Miller Chevalier, and Matt talks to us about the firm's 2016 Latin American Corruption Survey. Got a lot of good information for the compliance practitioner, and I think you'll enjoy it. Matt's a well-known thought leader in FCPA compliance and ethics, particularly focused in Latin America. And episode comes in just over 20 minutes. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I'm very pleased to have back with me my former colleague, but still good friend, Matt Ellis. Matt is left the independent lawyering world to become a partner at Miller Chevalier. And Matt, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. It's always great to be with you on the podcast.
So, Matt, Miller has released its 2016 Latin American Corruption Survey. I noted you were one of the participants from the law firm end, helping put this together, and you also gave some quotes on the email alert that went out. And so I wanted to see if maybe we could take a look at some of the highlights of what you and your team, and indeed the corresponding law firms that you guys use in Latin America, found out about what the survey told you around corruption, the perception of corruption in Latin America in 2016.
Great. I'm happy to share the highlights.
So a couple of things struck me, Matt. The first was you found an increased familiarity with the FCPA, and I suppose that's not surprising given everything that's gone on in Latin America around anti-corruption or bribery and corruption and the investigations that we're both aware of. But I still found it to be a very positive finding. Did you have any thoughts one way or the other on that?
Yeah, no, it was, that was certainly a notable finding. I mean, the fact that there continues to be more and more knowledge, awareness of the FCPA in Latin America. It's not a surprise for practitioners. There continue to be numerous headline FCPA enforcement actions involving the region. Those actions tend to get, significant coverage locally. Overall, we found that, almost 3/4, 72% of respondents to the survey are familiar with the FCPA, and that went up from the 2012 when it was 65%. But we're also seeing a notable increase among respondents from local and regional companies, and I think that's perhaps the more important gauge. So companies in the region and people working for those companies, back in 2012, less than half were aware of the FCPA. Now it's up to almost 60%. And then finally, even respondents who don't appear to be subject to the FCPA because perhaps, they don't work for a subsidiary of a U.S. company or an affiliate of a U.S. company or a company that's publicly listed in the United States, even among those respondents, 3/4 are saying that they're very familiar or somewhat familiar. So I think it's just striking to see the impact that the FCPA has had over the years in the region.
So, Matt, one of the things that I advocate as often as I can is that there are business solutions to legal problems, and corporate anti-corruption compliance programs are a business solution to the problems articulated in the FCPA. Are you able to separate sort of the knowledge of the FCPA and corporate compliance as a business response, separate and apart from some of the more prominent investigations that have generated a lot of publicity, for instance, with Petrobras in Brazil?
I think the closest we get, and I agree with that point. I mean, there's the business case for compliance. I think the closest that the data gets to shining light on that proposition is the fact that this is consistent with the prior surveys we conducted. Publicly traded companies, are in respondents from those companies are always so much, there's so much higher, more frequent awareness of FCPA among those companies. There's more attention to compliance among those companies, and that flows back to perhaps a number of different reasons, but one, and this is what, as practitioners see day to day on the ground, is just the business pressures that these companies experience to have adequate compliance infrastructure in place. It's not just the threat of enforcement, it's your business partner wanting to make sure that you have compliant practices. It's your external auditor wanting to make sure you're thoroughly investigating indications of wrongdoing. It's the underwriter of bond when the company issues bonds to the market, wanting to be sure that the company has a sound program in place. So the data does support that. Publicly traded companies by far are more in tune to these issues.
Let me follow up on something you said, because I found that very interesting, Matt. You said that underwriters who issue bonds for what I have to assume would be privately traded companies are very interested in making sure that not only their companies are well run and business-wise efficient, but also that they're not going to get in trouble through a bribe payment or a corruption payment. And having a best practices compliance program, or at least a minimum best practices compliance program, would be one way that a bonding company or a company financing privately held company could do so. Have you seen that phenomena in Latin America as well?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I've worked on those cases, representing to underwriters the practices of your client in order to get them to a level of comfort that there isn't some hidden liability there. So certainly that is a factor today in Latin America.
Have you seen that from underwriters, Latin American underwriters, or would these be North American or European underwriters?
These are North American.
Well, I've often thought that things will change when the bankers, bond underwriters, and moneylenders start requiring compliance, and I find that to be a very positive step forward if the underwriters are really actually taking the time and trouble to make someone like yourself make a presentation for a company seeking funding. So I view that as a very positive change.
Yeah, I agree. And, we see it with private equity as well. Sophisticated institutional investors, taking steps to ensure that, private equity firms are investing in companies that, are doing business pursuant to or not based on bribery. So that's another market force at play more and more in my business. And, I know that the business of my colleagues as well.
Matt, several of the other highlights or substantive highlights really, I'd say, were perhaps a little less positive. And nevertheless, I think they need to be discussed because they're in here, and I'm going to kind of group them together and ask you to maybe unpack them a little bit. So one highlight was that anti-corruption laws are generally perceived to be ineffective. A second was nearly all respondents felt state-owned enterprises and political parties are corrupt. And then the report named the three most corrupt economies, which were Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for at the end for Venezuela, but could you maybe unpack those findings and really let us know what you read from those findings and how a compliance practitioner might be able to use that going forward?
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is, what this data shows, and I encourage your followers to, go to the Miller and Chevalier website and download a copy of the report, because there's a lot of data there and a lot of specific analysis. And, this is different than just respondents saying, oh, yes, everybody is corrupt, right? And, you often hear that in Latin America, but there is a lot of detail. Another thing is that, you consider that this is the third time we've done this survey. It's the third time in 8 years. And when you're comparing the results with the results in 2012 and then back in 2008, you begin to see interesting trend lines. And one of those trend lines is there's a lot of consistency in these, views on whether laws are adequate, whether they're being enforced adequately, whether companies think they've lost business to competitors who are paying bribes, whether companies are reporting instances of apparent bribery to authorities when it occurs. And so, real detailed questions, and we're seeing trend lines, and you're right. The result is what I've been calling ossified attitudes related to corruption risk in the region. So, for an outsider looking to invest in the region, for companies doing business in the region, bribery risk is certainly real. I think it is important to point out a few silver linings, which come out for the first time in this year's report. And that is two countries over the last few years that have made significant headway in local prosecutions. And what are those countries, Tom?
Well, I would have to say Brazil.
Of course.
But also with Mexico, because and with Mexico, I would say, although they're perhaps slow at reform, they passed what I think will be a very robust law. And then certainly in Guatemala, I think we've seen some pretty dramatic steps.
Good. Yeah. So Mexico, those changes don't yet show up in this data since the new law was signed, a week and a half ago. But Guatemala, certainly, like Brazil, it's a country that has made significant progress in applying its anti-corruption laws to the highest levels of government. The former president of Guatemala is in jail now for customs-related bribery schemes. And in those two countries, what the data shows, and this is different from other countries, it shows that, people do think that there has been an increase in the importance of preventing corruption by companies. In Brazil, we see that increase over the last 5 years, 81% saying that, yes, our companies care about preventing corruption, which is above the regional average of 71%. And similarly, in Guatemala, there are more Guatemalans who believe that an offender is likely to be prosecuted locally. That's up 29 percentage points, up to 65% in 2016 compared to 36% in 2012. And what this tells us is local prosecution does matter. It does make a difference. Once local countries, and we might see this in Mexico as well, once they begin to enforce their laws, it sends a message to local businesses that, hey, look, impunity is no longer the name of the game. There are potential negative consequences for engaging. Interesting finding that came out of it.
So, Matt, this survey, of course, focuses on corruption survey, but as part of what you do in your practice and your group's practice at Miller, you also look at and talk to compliance practitioners in Latin America. Do you find
Or
not only sort of a more sophisticated or more better practices from companies who are headquartered in Latin America now?
Yeah, so the first thing to note is, one interesting thing about the methodology of this survey was that we partnered with 13 law firms throughout the region, and
Right.
those law firms distributed the electronic, online survey to their contacts. So, the people who are responding, the more than 600 people who responded to the survey, these aren't just people from the United States or people who work for U.S. companies or big multinationals. I mean, we really got a flavor of attitudes from different sources. And what we're finding, and this really jumped out, is the first time since we've done the survey, as you say, there are different levels of sophistication and maturity in terms of compliance are now emerging in the region. Some countries display local compliance efforts that are way ahead of the pack. Obviously the United States, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia are the four that we note that, when it comes to having policies in place or doing trainings or vetting third parties or having internal reporting mechanisms in place, there are higher percentages saying, yes, we're starting to adopt those mechanisms than the regional average. Now, there's a second group which are right at the median. So there's, Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay. And these are countries that, it appears their sectors are making efforts to develop compliance safeguards. And then there's what we're calling least developed, a group of countries that really are below the average in terms of embracing compliance standards. And the reason for me this is so interesting that the data shows this is because it really reflects what we're seeing on the ground. I mean, Tom, when you go to speak at a conference in Brazil, I mean, it's overflow, right? I mean, there's serious interest. There's, local, homegrown approaches now to compliance. They're very capable compliance professionals in that market. Same thing with Mexico. Perhaps if you were to go to Argentina or Peru, it wouldn't be the same thing. I mean, if there were a compliance conference in Peru, perhaps not many people would attend now. So, that's anecdotal, but this data seems to support what practitioners are seeing on the ground.
So let me turn to one particular country, and it's Venezuela. In your substantive highlights, you had a sentence that frankly stunned me, and I have to read as a direct quote. And it says, quote, "No Venezuelan respondent believes the company's anti-corruption laws are effective, comma, the only country surveyed to have a 0% response," end quote. Matt, I have never seen in any survey, whether it would be the Miller Chevalier Latin American survey or indeed any others, where no one in a country believed that, no one, as in zero, believed that the anti-corruption laws were effective. And it really points to something that I've been trying to get people's attention around, which is what I believe to be just inherent corruption around PDVSA right now and in the Venezuelan economy. And I guess that this finding really supports what I've been writing about, but the message I want to get to compliance practitioners and corporations is if you're doing business in Venezuela, the U.S. government's coming, and they're reading this, and they probably have a lot more insight than you and I do, and that you need to go in and get an assessment of where you are with your entire Venezuelan operations and begin remediation as soon as you can. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and the other, I think, striking data point from Venezuela is the fact that every Venezuelan respondent said that they saw, quote unquote, significant corruption, not some corruption, not low corruption, but significant corruption in the executive branch and in state-owned companies in Venezuela. Every respondent said that. You're right to point out that Venezuela really rises above the rest in terms of a real high-risk environment. I mean, what can be perhaps considered a dire situation, presenting serious corruption risk. We've written a lot about it on the FCPA America's blog, and you're right to point it out. Now, one thing to mention is, and I'm sure, Tom, you've seen this, I mean, so many companies are just trying to get out of Venezuela now for a number of factors, this being one of them. There are impediments, local legal impediments to simply closing down a shop and picking up, and leaving the country. That being the case, you're entirely correct. I mean, we know I have a blog post that will be published soon about the number of prosecutions surrounding PDVSA now, and it also highlights it's not just the U.S. authorities. I mean, there is cooperation with the Swiss authorities, with the Spanish authorities now, in terms of tracing funds, getting access to bank accounts, and really honing in on illicit activity as it relates to Venezuela, PDVSA. So I think you're right to highlight that. For me, that was one of the key takeaways from this survey report.
Yeah, and you brought up a lot of other issues that are related to doing business in Venezuela. Obviously, the at least perceived instability of the government, the hyperinflation. They have a whole host of problems, and there are several ongoing FCPA investigations that have been publicly announced. We've had a series of high-level, or at least prosecutions of individuals, and the thing that I've been wondering about is, at some point, is some U.S. company who can't get their money out or is faced with a demand for a bribe going to go after the PDVSA subsidiary in the United States, Citgo, because Citgo is still making money, and they're a big cash cow for PDVSA, and I don't pretend to know the answer to that, and that may be the subject of something else we have to visit on, but I've really been wondering about that, given all of the instability and the points you raised about companies not being able to get their equipment and or money out of Venezuela. But if someone is listening to this and, they've either done business with PDVSA or they've done business with a supplier to PDVSA, what would you suggest? Where would they start to just assess where they are, or even look at their operations to see? Should they start with third parties? Should they look at Gifts, Travel, and Entertainment? Should they just pick up the phone and call you? What should they do?
Well, with Venezuela, analyzing the movement of funds, the financial controls or lack thereof is so key, given the currency conversion, and so many of the issues that companies are dealing with relate to getting their money out of the country, and that has hatched a lot of creative approaches to managing those currency pressures. So I think that would probably be a good place to start. Just looking at the financial controls, making sure doing a targeted audit, sampling of key accounts. I would most likely recommend that be a starting place to an audit.
Follow the money. Excellent advice. Excellent advice. Well, Matt, let me flip to something that I think is perhaps even more near and dear to your heart, and I'm certainly excited about it. You're coming out with your first book. So I know you've worked on this quite a while, and I've been one of the people that have really encouraged you to come out with this, because I think you're really a thought leader in anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance in Latin America, at least sitting here in North America. So why don't you, could you tell us a little bit about the book and where you might be in this process?
Yes, and you definitely, Tom, you've been an inspiration to me for helping pull this work together. I'm very excited about it. It's called the FCPA in Latin America. It's the first book about the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and region specific in Latin America, and it's due to be published in September. It's being published by Corporate Compliance Insights. After I roll out the English version, I'll be publishing versions in Spanish and in Portuguese. And really what it does is it helps kind of unpack how companies are taking or considering culture and local realities and building out their compliance programs. I mean, compliance is, by its very nature, has to consider how different people of different backgrounds approach these types of safeguards. And so it provides a lot of helpful guidance on what companies are doing to manage corruption risk successfully in places like Brazil and Colombia and Mexico. And so it also talks a lot about key FCPA enforcement actions in the region, why those are relevant. It's a fun little book. And so please keep an eye out for it. It'll be published next month in September. And I'm grateful that the process is, I admire you, Tom, for publishing so many books, because I've learned it's not easy to write and to publish a book, but here I am almost done with the process.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and speak for you and commit you to come back for a podcast when the book comes out, because I certainly want to visit with you about it, and I'm excited for it to come out and look forward to getting a copy myself. So, Matt, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, but I was wondering if anyone wanted to follow up with you directly on anything we've talked about today, or maybe even inquire a little bit more about the book. Could they contact you or email you? And if so, how would they do it?
Certainly, they can contact me directly. My email is mellis@milchev, milchev.com. I encourage you to go to the Miller Chevalier website and look for the Latin America Corruption Survey report. It's a good read. There's a lot of important information in there, especially if you're giving trainings in the region or working to modify your compliance programs in the region. It'll help present good guideposts for doing so.
Well, Matt, thanks a lot for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to the publication of your book, and perhaps get you on again shortly thereafter.
Will do. Thanks, Tom, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I will have the link to the Miller and Chevalier 2016 Latin American Survey in the show notes to this episode, so you can link directly to it. I would urge you to go to the show notes and get that report. It's a lot of information. If you're a compliance practitioner, there's a lot of information that you need for your program going forward if you're doing business in Latin America. Also, don't forget the Red Flag Group webinar. You can check it out at the Red Flag Group website, which is www.redflaggroup.com under webinars. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.